Oh, goody. It looks like it's actually working. It's actually a refreshing change from recently. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip uh, uh, back and forth through a couple letters here because I'm going to combine a couple things. Where I'm at in the C's is in communism. I'm also going to skip ahead and add Marxism to that too, just to kind of put everything together. Again, this is going to be definitely something that's going to cross at least two different things and reasons for this. One being, the testing, standardized testing that unfortunately is forced upon everyone, but is also going to help with social studies, civics, government type of classes, as well as just sort of given the state of people on social media and things like that. Hopefully, will give some clarification to people who like to bandy about a lot of phrases and, shall we say, banners, maybe without actually understanding what it is that they're going for. And that goes on either side, whether they're capitalism or communism or kill all the billionaires and all this other stuff. It's like, let's back up a little bit, actually understand what it is that we're talking about on either side, and hopefully get rid of the sides. All right, so communism itself is the theoretical, economic, and social system in which land and capital are collectively owned and class divisions do not exist. So the money and all the stuff everything's built on is sort of, the property, so to speak, of everyone in that area, or however they're dividing the lines or whatever it might be, and that there isn't a ruling class and a working class. There aren't, nobles and those that owe fealty to them or any of this other stuff. It's in terms of social and economic ideas, everyone should be on the same page. I hate that phrase, but also the name applied to the socialist system controlled by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and other countries. It's an important distinction to note. It's a name applied to the socialist system. Maybe I'll throw in socialism on this too. But that is more sort of, there is a sort of larger government control of things. And the idea was, okay, well, we have this larger government control and eventually that'll be gone and everyone will get into this egalitarian communist state. Never happened. The word, from the same root as communal and community, implies common ownership and cooperative effort, the antithesis of capitalism, the opposite of. Philosophers and social reformers have long envisioned perfected societies partly or entirely based on the communal model. For example, the, quote, philosopher kings in Plato's Republic were seen as living communally, sharing everything and owning nothing. That would have been their sort of status would have been more sort of like, all right, well, this is how we're going to sort of direct the society. Thomas More's fictional Utopia of 1516 imagined an ideal commonwealth based on common property, mutual benefit, and universal tolerance. The diggers of 17th century England practiced an agrarian communism, farming, that abolished private land and all social distinctions. Perfect communism was thought by Marx, among others, to have existed in ancient tribal societies. But in civilized world, the communist ideal has never been realized outside of small-scale religious communities and short-lived communal experiences. The problem with that is that even in those, at that time, and I have, and which came out a little bit later, things like Golden Bough by James Fraser. I'm not going to give his title as Sir because his utter, even for the time, disgusting racism is just mind-boggling, and it hurts to try and read. So I haven't finished it because I just can't get through it. But no, there were certain, there were like councils, and certain people due to their feats and skills and talents, and or you know, kind of taking the reins in some extent too, became somewhat a little bit more in terms of the decision making of the groups. So a lot of things had mostly councils. So it wasn't always, maybe you might have heard, something as a chief or a war chief or this. Yeah, they had some people who, depending upon the nation or the clan or the community of indigenous people, there might have been sometimes, if it had been okay, well, everything's kind of relaxed and groovy right now, so they had councils, they had elders, they had other people whose kind of opinion people followed. They were the leadership of this. And sometimes if there was times of kind of war, then there would be always like, well, these people now are the ones that are sort of like the generals almost. So there was structure to a lot of indigenous communities. I mean, it wasn't hard and fast like we have it now. It wasn't, okay, one person owns all the stuff that we're doing and we have to give them, whatever they're using as things to barter or anything like that. It wasn't like the mob where we had to give a certain amount up to the chief or anything like that. But there were people who, the way things evolved, were involved in the decision making, and a lot of the times the majority wasn't. They might have had voting and things like that, but there were in some places in different it still wasn't like people had different sort of jobs and talents, maybe not necessarily classes so much, but there was a certain structure that did evolve. Communism as a political ideology arose in the early 19th century. The term was at first used as a synonym for socialism, a state or workers' control of the means of production, but later became associated with the view expressed by Marx and Engels, Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto, 1848, that capitalism could be overthrown only by violent revolution, not through gradual evolution. Marx conceived of full communism as the final stage of history, when the state would wither away. Collective labor would produce a permanent surplus of necessary goods, and each person would contribute according to ability and receive from the common storehouses according to need. Marx's vision of full communism was never approached by the USSR, the first revolutionary communist state, or by any of the other nations led by communist parties. A lot of the times the people who led some of the revolutions in some of those other countries, and it was very bloody and very violent, and then they led a very violent and very bloody, practically fascist state after that. All have been, to a greater or lesser extent, examples of totalitarian state socialism, characterized by central economic planning and rewards conditioned on performance, as well as party loyalty. Marxism-Leninism, adopted as Soviet orthodoxy under Stalin, purported to combine Marxist economic theories with Lenin's doctrine of democratic centralism, which called for grassroots participation and free debate of policy within the Communist Party hierarchy. That didn't happen. In reality, Marxism-Leninism reinterpreted both men's thinking in order to justify dictatorial rule and enforce rigid party discipline. Soviet dominion over world communist ideology was weakened from the 1950s onward by the defections of China, Yugoslavia, and Albania from the Soviet orbit, by the nationalist character of communist movements in post-colonial African and Asian countries, and by the rise of Eurocommunism, as several communist parties in the West adopted platforms that urged democratic, social, and economic reforms within capitalist systems. Within the Soviet Union itself, Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization program in the 1950s and Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms in the 1980s virtually abolished orthodox Soviet communism. There was in pure so an anonymous quote from Eastern Europe: under capitalism, man exploits man. Yeah. Under communism, the situation is reversed. Which would still be man exploiting man. I, hmm, I don't. Sorry, that one threw me. I was like, oh, there's a quote that's probably going to be meaningful. It just ended up confusing me a little bit. So, part of the thing that they're talking about is, I think what's important is a person would contribute according to their ability and receive according to need. So, in other words, it's not going to be a whole lot of people hoarding a whole lot of things. It's not going to be, uh, that I'm sorry, sort of disgusting rule of he who dies with the most toys wins. You don't. You die, and you got stuff that's now gotta people have to figure out what to do with. One of the things that tends to get things gummed up, sometimes I think in a lot of thinking and even in practice, is the idea of um, equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity, absolutely. Equality of outcome, that there's was it Einstein I think said it was like, if you judge a fish with it by its ability to climb a tree, you'll think you have a very stupid fish. So that idea I think really needs to be really paid attention to, the idea of contribute according to ability. Not everyone has the same ability across the board. Not everyone has the same talents. Not everyone can develop the same skills across the board. I'm barely 6 foot. I've got a very sort of little bird bone frame. I overheat very easily. There's a lot of things I am physically not able to do, especially since I'm a little older. I got a hurt back. Can't do a lot of stuff. When there are people half my age, twice my size, who can do a lot more in some things. Maybe I can contribute in more, brainy stuff, but then again, I'm not like super genius in things either. So there are other things I can't do that. So, some of the ways things got gummed up is just, people with clipboards going, you do this, you do this, you do this, that might not work. Sometimes it works out. Jet Li was like 8. The party people who were running the school went like, oh, he's jumping around and doing all this great stuff, and seems to have a lot of energy and is fairly agile. Put him in the modern wushu stuff, and now all of a sudden, 10 years later, he's starting to go in. He's like the most decorated, wushu champion in like Chinese history, and is starting and be in movies by 18, 19, and 30 years later, 30, 40 years later, he's this huge international megastar. Works out for that. A lot of people doesn't work out that way for. A lot of people. Um, so there's I think some of the ideology isn't thought of correctly by some people, and they'll just be like, oh, everyone just gets everything equally, and you just do. The problem with that is human nature. If I if everyone is getting 100 widgets, you have to do 100 widgets a day to get your 100 dollars or something like that a day, or whatever it is, and for some reason I'm physically incapable of making that quota, but I still get the same of everyone else. Everyone else is going to be like, well, why the hell am I working this hard too? So it's really important, I think, that people really make sure that they're understanding the idea of according to their ability. It's not, it originally, ideally, it's not just no one owns anything and everyone's treated free equally and we can dance with the butterflies with rainbows coming out of our ears. No, there still has to be effort put in, and people still have to be able to have a certain amount of individuality with what they do and how they do it. So that according to their ability, I think, is very important. Marxism, a tradition of critical thought and political action derived from the social and economic theories and revolutionary politics of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Also, I want to point out something. Both the communism and this are pointing something out. These are political, social, and economic ideas. So there's still a certain treatment of people as economic figures, which is what capitalism does too. So there's they mentioned Plato's, philosopher king. That was a little bit more integrated, of more of a actual civilization idea, because it wasn't just political and economic, but there was like a religious and artistic and philosophical aspect to it too. So that was a broader idea and ideal, where sort of Marxism, communism is trying to almost sort of oppose capitalism. In capitalism, you're a number on a spreadsheet. Are you producing? Are you making something now? Are you making me profit? Are you and that sort of thing. So it is sort of trying to challenge that, and so that's where I think some of the things in things like USSR and China and some of these other places, Cuba or anything else, gets messed up too, because it still treats people as numbers on a spreadsheet as opposed to actually people. What are you sighing at? Okay, from the late 19th century to the present, diverse interpretations and applications of Marxian theory have arisen, so Marxism cannot be easily or tidily defined. Marxist analysis, however, tend to share certain assumptions. These include the proposition that capitalism is based on the exploitation of wage labor, which alienates people from their true capacities and from each other. In other words, so it was, the people who benefit the most from capitalism is not the group, it's a small number of elite, and they're maintaining their status of elite and elevating their status sort of on the backs of everyone else, kind of working and sort of paying up into them. And then people with the competition, and the false interpretation of Darwinism, sort of social Darwinism, of it's just a law of the jungle, which is kill or be killed, which is not the way nature works, but was just one of many ways things were taken out of context in order to sort of try and justify treating people like garbage. And that creates a separation from people, because they're competing to try and be now an elite and be able to just sort of hoard wealth and stuff. And that's what capitalism will promote, is that separation from people that, do whatever, that the sort of Machiavellian, do whatever you have to do to get ahead. The ends justify the means, and the ends are you winning, and you win by you have more stuff and money than other people, and that sort of gets this sort of sociopathic, divisive drive into people. The social, political, and cultural systems are shaped by exploitive economic relations, which create and perpetuate mutual hostile class divisions, and that class conflict and the system's own contradictions will lead to its overthrow and replacement by a more equal and just socialist society. So in those terms, it's eventually that just sort of people eating each other sort of thing will eventually reach a breaking point, and there will be some sort of revolution, and that revolution will now make it so people can live in a more sort of just and equitable society where they're not as exploited, and things can be sort of measured out much more as according to need, as opposed to just pure sort of greed and desire. I would also remind people that after generations of one way of going, you're not going to erase the epigenetic conditioning in one revolution or even generation. You're not. A lot of the times, and this is one of the reasons why some of those other ones that they mentioned before sort of turned sour the way they did, is you get people who are exploited and sort of beat down for such a long time. Now they're the ones with the power, and they grew up in a certain sort of mental conditioning that's going to inform the way they behave, as well as an economic theory and a prescription for revolutionary change. Marxism is a philosophy of history, which is seen as dialectical process of progressive change arising from conflict, and a philosophy of human nature, seeing people as defined by their relations within society and fulfilled by controlling the fruits of their labor. Marxist principles have thus been applied to a variety of fields. For example, Marxist literary criticism approaches texts in terms of their ideological assumptions and historical contexts. Historical context, all right, that's excellent. And generally holds that a work of art always serves a social purpose, implicitly or explicitly supporting or condemning prevailing conditions. So kind of getting away from that aestheticism we talked about before, where it's a sort of like, no, art's for art's sake. We're creating beauty because we want to create beauty. It's like, no, whatever we're doing either serves this sort of machine that's running things, or it's helping to give people something to try and sort of take it down almost. Marxists have diverged from Marx to a greater or lesser degrees, and from each other in numerous ways. These include, notably, debates over an apparent contradiction in Marxist theory, the historical inevitability of proletariat revolution versus the role of human agency in bringing it about. So the idea in what they just talking about in Marx, that eventually the dialectic is like a dialogue. So it's a series of questions and answers sort of thing. So the idea is this is an inevitable thing of this control happens, it gets too much, and then people rise up and take it down, and that almost talks about, oh, this is almost a natural cycle, versus some people saying then that no, we are doing this to help free ourselves. So even with that, you have that sort of question of, what are we doing for ourselves? What are we taking for ourselves and everything like that? So then that again is going to have a certain separation of people. There's like, hey, we're going to lead this revolt, and other people, whether or not they're going to follow it, and that's going to create a hierarchy. And then there are going to be people, well, this wasn't going to happen without me doing this anyway. So that's some of the debate with that. And over the question of whether the socialist revolution must be violent or can be achieved through gradualist democratic methods. During much of the 20th century, Marxist thought developed largely outside of and in opposition to Soviet orthodoxy. Trotsky and his followers, for instance, argued that Stalin had betrayed the Marxist principles of workers' democracy and proletarian internationalism. Oh, yeah, Stalin was a monster. After the Second World War, with capitalism more vigorous than ever, European and American Marxists turned to analyzing the means, including mass media and consumer culture, through which Western workers were seen as having been co-opted and incorporated into the system. The revisionist Marxism of post-war European intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Louis Althusser, and members of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, rejected much of the classical Marxist analysis as overly deterministic and dualistic. The new left that emerged in the late 1950s repudiated Eastern European totalitarianism while remaining critical of capitalist hegemony in the West. So they're kind of like, both of y'all messed up. These Marxists over in the USSR are they were a lot of monstrous things. But then this Western sort of capitalism is screwing people over too. After the 60s, European social democrats and Euro-communists, having distanced themselves from Moscow, sought the democratization of capitalist institutions rather than their overthrow. The fall of the Soviet Union and its satellite governments was widely seen as the final repudiation of Marxism. However, since the conditions Marx and Engels identified still exist, now on a global scale, many social critics still give validity to their analysis. So it's just, that's why you see now sometimes people on Facebook or anything like that are still calling, oh, hey, we're getting a $1,200 stimulus check, and someone did the math, and it only cost $1,200 to build a guillotine. Just saying, we can kill billionaires. And it's like, part of me is sort of like, you're still calling for people to die. And again, if you were like, hey, the French Revolution, well, the French Revolution did not turn out well. If you're going to quote history, pay attention to the history. If you want to be a true Marxist, the true Marxist is using historical context. What's the historical context of the French Revolution? Stormed the Bastille, killed a bunch of nobles. All of a sudden now the revolution turned on its leaders, started killing them, started killing people in these almost witch hunts sort of things. So if you coughed funny, they were cutting your head off. Then there were military conscriptions within a couple years, so everyone had to start going into military. A little bit after that, Napoleon rises up the ranks, and we have a military imperialism rising out after only a few years after the revolution. So if you want to go historical context, let's pay attention to the historical context. So a lot of times, it's be wary of people cherry picking certain things, whether they're cherry picking, hey, under capitalism, we can have it where anyone can pull themselves up and make something of themselves and everything, which isn't exactly true either, because people don't have the equality of opportunity. People of color, women, LGBTQ plus people, let alone now if we're getting into people with indigenous backgrounds, and if I remember correctly, the reservations might still legally be seen as prisoner of war camps. I think Pine Ridge is prisoner of war camp 44, if I remember correctly. So it's like, no, this isn't good. There does need to be a shift. It can't go the way like the sort of Leninism, Stalinism was, because that was gulags and bread lines, and people just being killed or assassinated whenever. And Stalin was responsible for 10, 12 million deaths or something like that, outside of the deaths that were incurred with soldiers during World War II. And as people want to have all the fancy revolutionary t-shirts, and it was like, well, okay, you want to call for a revolution, but is it a revolution to help everybody, or is it a revolution to help the sociopath murderers that are sort of leading things sometimes? So there's a certain critical thought that I think needs to get put in more. So to define socialism on top of that too, because they mention it a couple times. Socialism, the economic system in which the means of production and distribution are controlled by the government or the workers, and decisions and the allocation of resources are made centrally or collectively. So again, still that sort of, instead of we've got one or two people like a CEO, or this one person sort of dictating how things are go, and hey, the company failed, but this person who's running it, instead of taking responsibility for the failure, is now getting a bonus that if they fed back into the company, might even be able to save it. Those sort of, instead of having that, it's like, okay, now all these things are seen as ideally under the sort of control and management of the people working there. And contrasted with capitalism, which operates on the principle of private ownership, profit, and competition within a free market. Like capitalism, socialism is also a social ideology, a view of human nature and the way the world should work. Should is actually italicized there. Socialism is an umbrella term for a variety of theories sharing the general view that people are basically cooperative, not competitive, and that systems of control based on private property, wealth, and class are harmful to the common welfare. It is thus applied to systems as disparate as Soviet communism and a capitalist welfare state. By capitalist welfare state, talking about things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, things like that. You know, you have in the United Kingdom, if you ever watch stuff from like England, it says the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. So think of if ABC, CBS, and NBC are all owned by the government, as opposed to, you know, ABC is owned by Disney, so whoever's running Disney, there's like NBC, Universal. I don't know what the hell's going on with CBS. They might have something to do with Showtime or something. I can't remember how all that all works. But you know, all these things, and then even in the United States, you have, you know, yeah, we have all these television. We used to be, you have a ton of television stations, tons and tons of magazines, tons and tons of newspapers, all these radio stations, and at one time, all these things were owned by 3 companies. You mean to tell me that these 3 companies aren't, you know, controlling what gets put out there? That's insane. But instead of having that, which would be, you know, again, the control of all that in the hands of now a very small, tight elite, with that, all this stuff would be in the hands of everyone, and the ideal that essentially human beings, if you know, taken out of the structures implanted in our society now of like aggressive greed and climbing and control and power and wealth and all that, taken away from that, people will essentially be cooperative and helpful to one another. Historically, socialists have differed over several basic questions of theory and practice. These include whether existing institutions can gradually evolve into socialism or must be swept away in a violent revolution. Sorry about that. Whether socialism must be imposed from above, example, by an educated elite, there's that elite again, or can be built from the bottom up by an autonomous mass movement. Whether central economic planning, decentralized decision-making, or even limited free enterprise is most desirable, and whether socialism is compatible with political pluralism or must be implemented by an ideologically dedicated one-party system. So, you know, in theory, technically, on paper, some of those other states like China or the USSR might technically have had maybe more than just Communist Party. It was like you were either in the Communist Party or you weren't doing anything. You weren't getting anywhere. You weren't having anything happen. If you weren't within that elite system of control, you were not having a good time of it. Your life was not going to be fun. So the political pluralism was, again, you know, having multiple, at least 2 political parties. In some of these other countries, like in Europe, they might have 7 or 8 or 9 political parties, and then they make like coalition governments where, you know, 2 or 3 of these parties that kind of get a certain majority, but maybe not enough of a majority, come together and they make a majority, and then that's the way things are kind of running with that now. It's hard to do that in the United States. The way the electoral college is, we kind of do have to have some sort of multiple of 2 in the party system. Like, oh, we need a third party. It was like, no, we need at least two new parties. Four. We need some sort of multiple of two to kind of way things kind of range out with that. So there are some people who determine themselves as being socialist. I had more technical problems. So I was going to say we have some people who are sort of socialists who are talking about, um, oh well, we have to have a bloody revolution, and some people are like, no, we can grassroots this, we can build it from the bottom up, which has the benefit of now you're changing conditioning, now you're changing the sort of hearts and minds of people as they go up, and changing the actual system and sort of social machinery as you go with that. And then talking about, oh, do we have the one party thing, or do we have other ones, and give that choice within it. So the term socialism came into common use in the early 19th century as the converse of individualism, the acquisitive, acquiring, ACQUISITIVE, self-interest espoused by Adam Smith and other supporters of capitalist enterprise. Adam Smith, one of the people that kind of got ripped off for, Declaration of Independence, Constitution. Modern socialist thought originated with Karl Marx, who conceived of socialism as the post-capitalist stage of history. So we'd have capitalism, and then after capitalism would be socialism, in which government control of the means of production under the dictatorship of the proletariat would eventually be replaced by communism, a perfect society, classless and stateless. Stateless, in other words, country divisions would also be abolished. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European socialist organizations and political parties were dominated by gradualists, so that sort of bottom-up mentality, such as German theorist Karl Kautsky. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, however, the Soviet Union became the model of socialism for many, and its example the template for revolutionary struggle. Following World War II, most Western socialists, repudiating totalitarian Stalinism and conceding the durability of capitalism, sought to reform rather than abolish capitalist institutions. Socialist and social democratic political parties advocated, and in Europe largely effected, the nationalization of key industries and the establishment of comprehensive state-sponsored social welfare programs. Yeah, a lot of Europe is technically seen as, having some socialism, including the United Kingdom. A lot of the, if I remember correctly, I think a lot of the sort of like Nordic countries and stuff like that are there too with it. However, in the African, Asian, and Latin American countries of the so-called Third World, many of them only recently freed from imperialist domination, or not even really freed from it, but still poisoned by it. Socialist and communist ideals continued to inspire revolutionary movements that were victorious in several countries, including China, Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. Most industrialized nations, particularly in Europe, now have some form of mixed market economy, mixed market being a little bit of socialist, a little bit of capitalist, in which private enterprise is balanced by limited public ownership and extensive government regulation and social planning. China sort of moved into that in the last 20 years or so. They started letting more sort of private or more open private ownership and things like that in there, and some of the uh, uh, admonishments of even U.S. capitalist things is, they open up certain things and labor's super cheap. So what some companies have done is supposed to, good American companies have gone over to like China or some of these other places and open up shop there, maybe even technically making their headquarters there. So now, they don't have to pay the same taxes they're not paying what we would here for labor, and those countries are again, the higher ups, the elite, are making money mostly off of this, on again sort of backs of the wage laborers. There we go, that's a word. With it as well, but so then the United States starts getting turned into more service economy. So it's just shops and restaurants all over the damn place. I'm from Lorraine, and we had that happen because we had Ford and Steel were really big in like Lorraine and in this sort of area of Cleveland and everything too. And what happened, it was cheaper to ship production in either, I think some of it went to Kentucky, some of it went to Mexico. And it ended up being cheaper for them to have that and then ship stuff back in, even with import-export tariffs, than it was to pay the taxes and pay the employees and deal with the unions, because they didn't have to deal with the unions in these other places, and do all this other stuff. So it again, it wrecked people's lives. It wrecked economies of areas, whole regions of place and everything like that, because a lot of these regions, including like the greater Cleveland area and Lorraine and everything, were kind of one trick ponies and all that. We try to make everything off of manufacturing and steel and Ford plants and stuff like that. And Akron and Canton had, like Goodyear and the tires and the rubber stuff and everything like that. And those didn't, those the people running those countries companies didn't give a crap about the areas they were in or the people that were, working for them. They just were worried about the bottom line. We're going to make more money for the company and more money for the elites within that company by moving stuff to now these areas that have become more open up for what we're going to do. This model most successfully realized in Scandinavia, so those Nordic countries, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, other places like that, where living standards are higher than in most of Europe and the United States, is seen by some as an ideal marriage of capitalism and socialism, combining the former's competitive incentives with the latter's social fairness, while avoiding exploitative labor relations and the bureaucratic rigidity of central planning. So they kind of, in this, it was talking about the idea was to kind of cherry pick the best from both those sort of sides of the system. The similar notion of market socialism, social ownership of the means of production within regulated free market economy, was adopted in Yugoslavia in the 1950s with mixed success. That whole area of the world is, has some problems and issues and a lot of things, so they were trying. All right, so that's just sort of, this is going to be part 2, because again, I had some sort of, just everything just sort of went gone and crapped out on me there for a minute. Supposed to be sort of socialism part 2. So that's kind of what the short version of what people are talking about with socialism and communism and Marxism, that might be seen as fairly pervasive in if you're on social media a lot and stuff now. So yeah, thanks.